It's a make or break year for Falcons general manager Terry Fontenot and offensive coordinator Zac Robinson.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 20 years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And to become an everydayer, all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today's episode, we will be answering some listener questions about various subjects and sort of talk a lot about why this 2025 season kind of boils down to Terry Fontenot and Zac Robinson, getting it right this year. But we're going to start out talking about Zac Robinson because, if anybody's going to give me a runway to complain about the Falcons offensive coordinator, I'm going to take that runway every stinking time. So these questions come from various Locked On Falcons insiders. And if you want to get priority on future mailbags and questions, of course, you can become a Locked On Falcons insider with the link in the description below, but we'll plug that later in the episode. So this first one comes from Demetrius M. He says, interested on your thoughts on the floor and ceiling for the offense next year, as well as whether you think we make any big blockbuster deals on free agency for the defensive side. So we're talking about the offense before free agency, or let's talk about the defense because I don't really have a lot to say. I don't expect the Falcons to make any blockbuster deals in free agency. We'll see if they start cutting people like Grady Jarrett and Caleb McGarry or whatever, that will change the math. But given that I'm not expecting those guys to get cut, I'm not expecting the Falcons to make any big blockbuster deals at this point. Like, if I was to guess, the most likely big contract that the Falcons would hand out is maybe to Jamie Sherwood, the linebacker from the Jets. That number could be north of $10 million. I've seen some projections that think it's going to be like $7 or $8 million, but I think we'll probably get north of $10 million there on that one. But that's about it at this stage. But we'll see how, as we get closer to free agency. But you're asking me about the offensive floor and ceiling. It's hard to make these projections until the Falcons make moves in the offseason. But I would say their ceiling is probably like the 7th best offense in the league. Their floor is probably like 20th best offense in the league. And sort of if you split the difference, that eye level would be about 14th. And the 7th best offense, according to DVOA last year, was Tampa Bay. The 20th was the Colts, and the 14th was the Falcons last year. So if they split the difference, they'll be basically the same level of offense that they were a year ago. And of course, like the questions with, that projection will change depending on things that happen this offseason. What happens with Kirk, what happens with Kyle Pitts, what happens with Drew Dalman. Those are probably the 3 moves that are most likely to move the needle in a positive or negative. Well, we know Kirk's not going to be back here. More on that later in the episode when we talk about, if the Jets are interested in Kirk Cousins. But, so Kirk's not really going to move the needle in that regard. But, you do wonder sort of who the Falcons get to replace him as a backup quarterback. Do they trade Kyle Pitts? I tend to lean currently 60% chance that they do trade Kyle Pitts, 40% chance that they keep him. Drew Dalman is ready to be a free agent. I tend to lean 60% chance that they keep Drew Dalman, 40% chance that he walks. So we'll see on that front. But, do you add depth at some key areas on the offense, like wide receiver, tight end, offensive line, that help move the needle and potentially raise the ceiling or raise the floor for this offense? Those are all unknowns at this point in time. But to me, the core for this Falcons offense and whether or not they reach their ceiling is whether or not Zac Robinson figures out the play action passing game. Right. And, for me, this was a big deal because going into that bye week, Raheem Morris was talking about, we'll fix the play action passing game. And they didn't really fix it. And that was one of several red flags that to me makes me a lot more skeptical of Zac Robinson moving forward than clearly the majority of Falcon fans. And I think the play action passing game is key because when I look at the data over the last couple of years and you look at pretty much every successful young quarterback in the league, first, second year, they're always playing, they're always producing a lot more play action passing offense than the Falcons were. I looked back last 5 seasons. So since 2020, looking at all the first and second year quarterbacks that have started at least 12 games and led their teams to 500 records or better. There have been 14 instances over the last 5 seasons where that has happened. 12 of those 14 quarterbacks threw for at least 1,100 yards in just purely off of play action in those respective seasons. The 2 exceptions were Kenny Pickett and his rookie and second season under Matt Canada, who got fired in his second season in 22 and 23, where he had only 343 yards and 387 yards off of play action. And the reason why the Steelers were successful, were winning games with Kenny Pickett, was not because of Kenny Pickett. It was because of their defense. And you look at Michael Penix, who had 114 yards in his 3 games off of play action. You extrapolate that for a full 17-game season, that would be about 646 yards off of play action. Kirk Cousins and Penix had a combined 575 yards off of play action this past year. And so basically what I'm sitting here telling you is all the successful quarterbacks produced double that number, 575. And so basically I'm sitting here saying that the Falcons play action passing attack has to be twice as good, at least, if this team has any chance of making the playoffs this upcoming season. And, this is further confirmed by when you look back at the, 32 teams in terms of play action passing. We talked about this before, where the Falcons, based off of the metrics, were the worst play action passing team in the NFL last year. If you look at the top 15 teams, 12 of those teams made the playoffs. The 2 teams that made the playoffs that were not in the top 15 were Kansas City and Pittsburgh. And the reasons why Kansas City was there, because Patrick Mahomes, and you basically, you can, you don't need a great play action passing attack if you have Patrick Mahomes, right? He's the exception to the rule. And Pittsburgh was there because, they have the defense again, right? So the problem is, like, you have to be able to figure out the play action passing in 2025. It's the year of our Lord 2025. It's not 1985. And if you want to play like a high level offense in 2025, play action is a core part of that. And so the biggest bet that the Falcons are making last year was on Zac Robinson. The biggest bet that the Falcons are making this year is on Zac Robinson. And the ways that he can figure out the play action passing game is being able to marry the run game to the play action concepts that they want to run. They were an outside zone run scheme. The obvious play action concepts that you run off of outside zone is bootleg. If they don't want to do bootleg, which they didn't really want to do bootleg last year, right? They probably ran a bootleg like 5 or 6 times the entire season. And the reality is you need to run 5 or 6 times bootlegs every single game. It's really kind of where the Falcons need to get to. But if you don't want to run bootlegs for whatever reason, then you have to change the run scheme, because you have to have these 2 things married. And that, to me, is, again, one of the other big red flags I had with Zac Robinson, which is like every other protege from the McVay-Shanahan coaching staff has figured this stuff out. And when you go back and you look at those top 15 teams in terms of play action passing, it's all, it's not all, but it's like a lot of McVay and Shanahan guys, right? Liam Cohen, Bobby Slowick, Matt LaFleur, all these guys, Kevin O'Connell, all these guys, they all figured it out. And again, that's the other red flag with Zac Robinson. Like, he's the one exception. Like, him and Thomas Brown are the 2 exceptions that haven't been able to figure this out. And Thomas Brown's now going to be on his 3rd team in 3 years. He's doing a heck of a job, right? He just keeps being part of coaching staff to get fired. And so, like, that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about the Matt Canadas and the Thomas Browns that are Zac Robinson's peers up to this point. So, I know a lot of people think I'm way too harsh on Zac Robinson because he's a poor little baby. You're not allowed to criticize. He's just an infant. Like, you're not allowed to criticize him. But I just think that's just fans being in denial over this stuff. We've been talking about play calling for 8 years on this podcast. We talked about it with, the beginning of this podcast. Locked On Falcons didn't exist until 2016. Myself and Alan Stirk took over this podcast after Thanksgiving, right before that offense went on its, run to go to the Super Bowl. And then, when Alan left the show in 2017, I spent the next 2 years talking about Dirk Cutter. I'm Steve Sarkisian. And then the 2 years after that, talking about Dirk Cutter. And then the 3 years after that, talking about Arthur Smith's play calling. And then last year, talking about Zac Robinson. Like, this ain't new, guys. We've been talking about play calling for 8 years. Zac Robinson ain't skating by simply because he's just a poor little baby. First-time play caller, just an infant that's never, ever called plays in the NFL. How you can't be mean to him. Just a little bit of itty-bitty baby, right? So, that may work for you. It don't work for me. So I say all that. I fully expect Zac Robinson to get better in year 2 because Kyle Shanahan got better in year 2. Steve Sarkisian got better in year 2. Dirk Cutter got better in year 2. Arthur Smith got better in year 2. So Zac Robinson is going to get better in year 2 because he has to, or else the season is doomed, guys. And that's why, like, I sit here on this podcast refusing, right, much to the chagrin of everybody around me, to pump Penix, right? Because it's all about the environment. Like, he's not going to be successful, not because he lacks the skill, but if he doesn't have the environment that will foster his development, and that includes being able to dial up probably twice as much play action as the Falcons were doing last year and it being effective, then it doesn't matter, how good and talented and how great he's going to be, because it's not going to work. So we'll see on that front. But we'll go from one make or break guy to another and talk about, how this draft is important for Falcons general manager Terry Fontenot. So when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, but there's no better place to get in on that action than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. Whether you miss the opening tip-off or you're just waiting for that fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Bet a little, win a lot. And even if you're not into the NBA, well, you're a Falcon fan, you're sitting there looking at the 19th best odds to win the Super Bowl. You're sitting here seething because Aaron had to make fun of that poor little baby Zac Robinson. And you're looking at those Super Bowl odds of plus 5,500, right? That means you bet $20, you win over $1,100. And so, hey, I'll throw $20 at the Falcons winning the Super Bowl next year just to shut Aaron up. By all means, you can do that by going to FanDuel. And if you're a new customer, you can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So our next question comes from Demetrius J, a different Locked On Falcons insider. And he asks, do you feel as this year's draft is the last opportunity for Terry Fontenot has to prove himself as a GM? If we miss the playoffs this year, do you think TF will get fired, or would it be more detrimental for Raheem Morris? So yes, this is the last draft that Terry Fontenot is guaranteed to be able to prove himself as a good GM. Right now, whether or not he's going to get fired if the Falcons miss the playoffs, that to me is a maybe. It depends on how it all goes. Like, basically what I'll say is I would have a hard time seeing Arthur Blank cleaning house after the season if they finish the season with a winning record, like a 9-8 record, but still manage to miss the playoffs, which, several teams have done pretty much every year since they expanded the playoffs. If you get 9-8 record with a first year starter under Michael Penix, I would assume Arthur Blank is going to be like, let's try to keep building this thing. It's going in the right direction. Maybe not at the pace that I want, but we're moving in the right direction, and they'll run it back with those guys. But obviously how you finish 9-8 again in this scenario matters, right? If you start the season 7-2 and finish 9-8, that's very different from starting the season 4-5 and finishing 9-8. So those are sort of unknowns at this point in time. But I would assume at this point that Terry and Raheem Morris are attached at the hip. It's hard for me to envision a scenario at this stage where one of those guys gets fired and the other guy remains. Maybe the one scenario that I feel like you could maybe suggest is like the Falcons finish like 8-9, but like they finish the season really strong, like rattling off like 3 or 4 wins against some playoff caliber teams. And that's enough for Arthur Blank to be like, okay, well, Raheem, you can stick around, but Terry, we're done with you, that sort of thing. So that to me is a very narrow bullseye to hit. So I just kind of assume that both of these guys will be back in 2026, or they won't. They both will be gone in 2026, depending on what happens in 2025. So yes, I think this draft matters a ton. Not only do the Falcons need to get some more immediate impact players in this draft to help them, win games in 2025, but you also want those players to kind of be the foundation and the bedrock for what will be successful teams in the long term, right? Being able to find multiple starters from this draft, and not just the guys that start games because the Falcons don't have better options, but guys that you can start and say like, yeah, that guy is an entrenched starter. He would start on the majority of other NFL teams. That's how good that guy is. And that's really not something that the Falcons have done consistently in the 4 previous drafts under Terry Fontenot. And so I think the big things that you want from this draft class is you want some foundational pieces for your defense. They need help at all 3 levels. Whether you get that help at all 3 levels, a lot of that will depend on free agency. If you can get, again, if you can get that linebacker in free agency, then, that leaves you to focus on the secondary and D line, and then whatever combination, what I'm saying. So we'll see on that front. I think you also need to get some foundational pieces on your offensive line, that you need to be able to find somebody that you can say is a future starter at either left tackle or right guard, because Jake Matthews and Caleb McGarry, assuming both are back this year, and I think that's a pretty safe assumption at this point in time, because again, what better options are the Falcons going to find in a draft class? Last year's draft class was the deep tackle class. This year's draft class, not so much, from what I can tell. Most of the tackles that are projected to go in the first round, a lot of people are like, that's a guard, right? And so, but the Falcons, hopefully we would get a decent developmental guy in the middle rounds. And hopefully that guy will be good enough that they'll feel like they have options should they decide to move off of Jake Matthews and or Caleb McGarry after this season. And so that's one box you got to check. At some point you'll move off of the other one, and so you're going to have to get two tackles at some point in the near future. But you can check one of those boxes this draft. And so, the other option in addition to the defense and the offensive line, again, we'll see if the Falcons accumulate enough draft picks to do this. I think you got to get another pass catcher in here, whether that's a tight end to groom behind Kyle Pitts or to replace Kyle Pitts, or that's a wide receiver to groom behind Ray-Ray McCloud or replace Ray-Ray McCloud. I think you need another weapon. But again, that's not necessarily a priority like the defense and the O-line are. But we'll see if the Falcons could do that. So, that leads to, do you have enough assets at this point to get all those things? No. So you're going to have to either trade some players like Kyle Pitts, like Kirk Cousins, which we know is not going to happen, but we'll talk about that more later. Or you got to trade back in the draft. And we talked about that on yesterday's episode, talking about the possibility of, moving back 5 spots in the mock draft example and picking up a 3rd and 4th round pick. And, that to me is like just the starting point. And then if, depending on how the second round goes, like maybe you can move back 3 or 4 spots and pick up a 5th or 6th round pick, or, and hopefully, like I said before, you have 5 picks right now. I feel like at minimum, you should be able to walk away from this draft class with like 7 picks. And hopefully those 2 additions are not just like 6th and 7th round picks. Like they're actually like premium picks in the 3rd, 4th round. But ideally, like you can get 8, 9 picks from multiple trade backs or multiple trades that you do this offseason. So we'll see if Terry can navigate that. I'm not particularly optimistic at this point in time, but it's, it makes for compelling, content and tremendous discussions. And so we'll see what Terry can do at this point. But, I'm not overly optimistic that, we're going to be sitting here a year from now being like, hey man, the Falcons are doing great. But again, that's because it's February, and I may be singing a different tune once we get to March and I actually see this team actually making good moves in free agency. And then we get to April and I see the team like, oh, I actually like some of these players. Like usually like the 1st round pick, I'm like, yeah, I like that player. And then everybody else after that point, I'm like, And so, and that's not just the Terry Fontenot thing. That was true of the Thomas Dimitroff drafts as well. So it's just one of those things where hopefully, I've joked before where, like Willie Moe was the last time the Falcons took a 2nd round pick that I was like, I want that guy, where I was like, yeah, that's my guy. William Moore. That was 2009. So it's been basically 15 years of me. That's part of the reason why, like, you don't hear me on that Thursday night episode after recapping round 1, basically like, here's my wish list for round 2, because it's basically in 15 years since the Falcons have actually drafted a player that was on my wish list. So I don't even hope anymore. So I just go like, they'll do what they're going to do. I'm probably not going to like what they do. That's definitely been the MO for Terry Fontenot, and we'll see if it winds up working out for them in the end. So yes, it is a make break draft for Terry Fontenot. We'll see what he winds up doing. But, in terms of, one of those players that could allow them to accumulate assets, there's some recent rumors about Kirk Cousins and the New York Jets, and we'll break that down on whether or not the Jets could be interested in trading for Kirk Cousins or it's something else as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So our next question comes from New Drop. He says, I know it's way too late in the game, but are there any types of things that you're hearing in regards to the Jets and Kirk Cousins out of curiosity? A channel that I follow that covers the team as well, who I kind of take with a grain of salt with most of the stuff that they post, but kind of was pushing the narrative, and it felt more like clickbait kind of thing to talk more like an opinion than actual kind of factual rumblings, if you will. So I was curious about that. So, with the Jets already sort of announcing upon the hiring of Aaron Glenn, their new head coach, that they will be parting ways with Aaron Rodgers. There's a lot of talk now who's going to be the next Jets quarterback, right? They don't know who their week 1 starter is going to be. They're picking 7th in the draft. And so that's not necessarily prime quarterback drafting selection in this year's draft. We'll see how it all plays out. So it will be something worth paying attention to if you're curious about the draft and whatnot. But I think a lot of this came from the digging I could do. Rich Cimini, who covers the Jets for ESPN, wrote last week that talked about the Jets going after Kirk Cousins. But the caveat to that was he was talking about the Jets going after Kirk Cousins if he's released, and would that make sense for him? And it was the idea that could Kirk Cousins be an effective bridge quarterback for the Jets for 1 year, or on a cheap veteran minimum contract if he's released? And I think the conclusion was maybe, kind of, sure, possibly that's an option. But I think because social media is the way that it is, they don't really report the facts. And so I think a lot of people saw, some things on social media and were sort of taking it out of context and thinking that this is a potential trade option, that the Jets would trade for Kirk Cousins. And I've discussed this before on the podcast, but they're not, right? That a team like the Jets and other teams, I think, when it comes to Kirk, are more interested in Kirk if he's released, right? It's a copycat league, and sort of the recent model of success is what Russell Wilson did with the Steelers last year, getting cut with guaranteed money still on the books for the Denver Broncos, signing for a veteran minimum and hoping that team go to the playoffs. We know that this is a copycat league, right? You go back to 21 and 22, where a bunch of teams made trades for quarterbacks thinking that was going to change their fortune. Basically, only the Rams and the first trade that kicked off that, the Rams and the Lions traded between Matt Stafford and Jared Goff, were the only ones that really worked out during that period of time. And you saw a dramatic drop-off in the amount of teams making those types of trades in 23 and 24, with Aaron Rodgers being the one exception. And clearly the Jets learned that lesson. It was like, we're not doing that again, trading for, a quarterback that's as old as Aaron Rodgers with the injury history, all that sort of stuff. So the Jets are not going to trade for Kirk Cousins. So their goal, like so many other teams, I think, is going to be signing him to a 1-year deal, following that Russell Wilson model, which is, if we can run the football and play good defense, that's the formula for our success. And we'll just ask Kirk to manage the game. Pittsburgh would be a team like that if Kirk is cut, only not if they traded for him. Cleveland and New York the Jets would be two teams that could follow that model. Both teams, I think, again, would only be interested if they were cut, because their cap situation is such that, they're not going to devote $25 million or $27.5 million in guaranteed money to Kirk Cousins. And both of their defenses did not play well in 2024, but the previous year were top 3 defenses. And so there's reason to think that they could rebound and just basically, hey, hand the ball off to Nick Chubb, hand the ball off to Breece Hall, and Kirk, throw it to the one receiver that we have, Jerry Jeudy and Garrett Wilson, and we'll be able to figure it out. The 3 other teams I think are in the mix that could theoretically want Kirk to play that style because they have good enough defenses at this point are Seattle, Las Vegas, and Tennessee. Seattle would be in that boat, but only if they find a way to trade Geno Smith, potentially to the Raiders, seems to be the most obvious option for that trade to happen. And so if Seattle were to trade Geno Smith, they would be in the market for potentially a bridge quarterback. The Titans with the number 1 pick, again, I'm skeptical of the Titans going after a bridge quarterback with the number 1 pick. They're either going to take a quarterback number 1, or, again, it's not guaranteed that they'll take a quarterback number 1, but I would assume that if they're not going to go with, whoever they think is the top quarterback in this draft class at the number 1 pick, that they're going to go after Sam Darnold or somebody else younger or better, Justin Fields or something like that, rather than signing up for 1 year Kirk Cousins. Same thing with the Raiders. I feel like the Raiders will either try to move up for a young quarterback, draft one, or, they'll go after Geno Smith or Justin Fields or Darnold or one of those guys. So I have a hard time seeing a robust market for Kirk Cousins, but we'll sort of have to see. So I've been pushing that notion for 2 months now on the podcast, and we'll see what changes in the next month between now and that deadline, that soft, hard deadline, or whatever you want to call it, that Jeremy Fowler of ESPN reported as. But everybody else is agreeing with me, guys. So, like, I'm not on an island when I sit here and tell you that eventually they are going to cut Kirk Cousins. And every rumor that you see that this team could trade for him is probably just somebody on the internet making it up, some random person. It's not coming from anybody that covers the league. I can tell you that. Jeremy Fowler's not doing it. ESPN, Rich Cimini's not talking about it. You know, we got the Locked On NFL scouting guys with Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino talking about ain't nobody traded for Kirk Cousins. Go listen to that episode when they talk about the Falcons cap situation from Monday or Tuesday, whenever you listen to that show. So, you know, ain't nobody trading for Kirk Cousins. It's a non-zero chance, but it's barely higher than zero. So we'll see on that front, but we'll keep you covered, you know, if any new information comes along. But yeah, the whole Jets thing, I think, was a lot of people misinterpreting what someone was writing. Someone was writing like, oh, the Jets could go after Kirk if he's cut. And people were like, oh, we could trade for Kirk. And, you know, I saw some things about like we could trade Kirk for Sauce Gardner straight up. And again, wild stuff out there. Like, you know, we could trade Kirk Cousins for Myles Garrett straight up. Like, I don't think you guys understand what Kirk Cousins' value is. You could trade Kirk Cousins for a backup kicker. That's about it at this stage of time. So our last question comes from Andy S. He asked, why haven't the Falcons drafted any Georgia Bulldogs in the first round? And so we've been talking about, you know, the Falcons Georgia connection over the last couple of days. So we'll talk about it another time. You know, I think there's only really been one opportunity for the Falcons to draft a Georgia player in the first round. That was Jalen Carter. Like, for me, basically, what I'll say, Andy, is I feel like there's only been really 4 players that Georgia players the Falcons passed on that I think if you're a Georgia fan, you have a legit gripe over the Falcons passing on that player for another player. Everybody else to me is just kind of just whining about a thing. like you're not seriously like, oh man, we should have drafted Christopher Smith or, you know, or somebody like that. So I look at it like the 4 I would say is the Falcons passing on the Kobe Dean in the 2022 draft for Troy Anderson, the Falcons passing on Jamal Sawyer in that same draft for Justin Schaefer, the Jalen Carter pick over, or the Bijan Robinson pick over Jalen Carter. And then last year where the Falcons traded up for Ruka Roro and probably should have drafted Kamari Lassiter. Those are kind of the 4 that I feel like you have a legit gripe if you're a Georgia fan for the Falcons not drafting. I think everything else is just piling on for, you know, just whining for the sake of whining. I feel like all of those decisions, you know, I'm not going to say are understandable. Like the Dean, like it's funny because Dean and Anderson have had kind of the reverse career. Like Troy Anderson was healthy his first year and then hasn't been healthy the last couple of years. Dean hasn't really been healthy any year, but he was less healthy in his first 2 years than this last year. And so it's allowed him to, when he's been healthy, play better football. When Troy Anderson was healthy, he was not as good a player. So that's causing some of the issues with why their perceptions are radically different. You know, Schaefer, the Falcons drafted Schaefer because they learned the wrong lesson from the Jalen Mayfield debacle. They like, oh, well, Jalen Mayfield didn't work because he was transitioning from a new position. And so even though Jamari Sawyer was way better than Justin Schaefer, like Justin Schaefer was an undraftable player, in my humble opinion. And Sawyer was probably like a 4th round talent or something like that. But because Sawyer didn't have experience playing guard, the Falcons didn't want to make that same quote unquote mistake, right? Again, the mistake with Jalen Mayfield was not transitioning him to a new position. It was just like, he just wasn't that good. That's really it. They took a project that needed 3 years of development and threw him to the wolves right out the gates. And that's why he failed, not because he was transitioning to the new position didn't help. Don't get me wrong, but he you know, you would have kept him at right tackle, he would have struggled in the NFL. But you know, I think the Carter over Robinson stuff or Robinson over Carter stuff, you know, I feel like that's the most forgivable, just given the off-field issues with Jalen Carter, as we discussed many times in the weeks leading up to that draft and the weeks coming out of that draft, which was like the Falcons were not going to draft Jalen Carter. And that is understandable because, you know, not to paint Jalen Carter as a bad guy, because I don't think he is. But, you know, I don't think you could realistically say, like, if you're grading his character based off of all that stuff, like, you know, it's like a C+ because of, again, not because he's a bad guy, but just because of incidents. And Bijan is A+, and it's just easier for you to sleep at night, you know, with an A+ character guy that you don't have to worry about than with Jalen Carter. And that's simple as that. Not to mention, I think the fact that the Falcons gave a bunch of guaranteed money to Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata in that offseason and the preceding offseason also meant that, you know, Jalen Carter would have been kind of buried on the depth chart or all that stuff. So, you know, and then I think with the Rukaroro thing last year, I thought Lassiter was a perfect fit for this defense. I wanted him in round 2. He had the right combination of size and speed and athleticism and being able to play in zone and all that stuff that made him a perfect fit at that cornerback spot opposite AJ Terrell. And I think the Falcons ultimately, ignored that issue for reasons. I think they traded up for Rukaroro because I think the Falcons were feeling pressure because of taking Penix. And they were like, well, we gotta be proactive and aggressive about addressing our pass rush. And so we're going to trade up for Rukaroro. And, it's fine. We'll see what Rook turns into, but he was a 3rd round talent, in my opinion. We'll see if he exceeds those expectations or outperforms those expectations. But, Lassiter was a 2nd round talent. There was plenty of other guys that were on the board that were more talented than Rukaroro, but I think the Falcons were like, we got to do something. And so they took Rook, and we'll see what happens with that. So I hope that answers your question, Andy. I feel like the whole, Falcons Georgia thing, I won't say it's much ado about nothing. It's a legit issue, but I think Georgia fans, because they want to merge their 2 fandoms and rather than keeping them separate, make a mountain. I'm not going to say a mountain out of a molehill because, they make a mountain out of a very large molehill. Let's say that a hill, right? So hope that answers your question. Those are the questions from the Locked On Falcons Insiders. And if you want to become an insider and be able to ask questions that get answered on podcasts, you can join at the link in the description below. You'll also get access to my film breakdowns of various draft prospects. We did some Senior Bowl prep guys of some of the pass rushers heading down to Mobile. Last week, we looked at some of the DBs, the top DBs in this draft class, 7 of them. We'll be looking at some of the top pass rushers later this week, as we get geared up for this combine. So continue to check that out if you're interested. It's 14-day free trial, so you can sign up and get those episodes free for the next 2 weeks. And then, after that point, it's $4.99 a month. So if you're interested in that, hit that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. If you want to submit other questions, you can do so via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can join the Locked On Falcons Discord in the link in the description below. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.